Our very first section of the museum that we're going to talk about today is the prehistoric history of Tustin. Some of you may wonder, what does that word mean, prehistoric? Well, pre means before, and the root word is history. So it means before history was ever recorded or written down by man. Now, you may wonder, how in the world can we know what that early history of Tustin was if there weren't any humans around to record it in the first place? Well, that's where I need you to take a look over here, because it's things like fossils and artifacts that are dug up from these ancient areas of Tustin that help us to know a little bit of what it was like long, long ago. So for example, take a look here. This is a whale vertebra, or part of the backbone of a whale. What in the world would that be doing in the hills of Tustin? Think about that. And for that matter, what about these other marine fossils? What about something like this fossilized clam? It was found in the hills of Tustin. Same thing with these little periwinkles. Fossilized seashells found in the hills of Tustin. What were they doing there? Well, when we stop and look at all the evidence, what it tells us is that Orange County was a lot different millions of years ago, before history was ever recorded. All this evidence points to the fact that Tustin was once under the sea, under an ocean. Can you imagine? Now, the basin, if you take a look here, had these things underneath it. And then it was much later, about 2 million years ago, scientists think that the hills were pushed up by the forces of nature, and the hills became the mountains around the Los Angeles and Orange County areas that we know today. And what was left was the flat land below the mountains that we call the basin. And that area, when the mountains rose and the basin sunk, it had the sea level drop and it receded. And what was left was a large, grassy, brush-covered marshy plain, and animals that are now extinct used to roam there. Animals like the saber-toothed tiger, giant sloths, mammoths, and mastodons. And this evidence helps us to know that. Now, around 8000 BC, the very first Native American tribes began to settle in what is now the Santa Barbara and Los Angeles area. So if you look here at the map of California, the early Indians of Los Angeles and Santa Barbara were called the Chumash tribe. And they settled in those areas in grassy plains, and there were also streams and marshes. Now, much, much later, around 600 BC, 600 years before Christ, further south in what is now Orange County, some non-Chumash tribes came in from the Mojave Desert area. And they settled in our region here in what is now Orange County. They were hunters, they were gatherers, and they were fishermen. And if you take a look here, we may want to just take a little bit of a close-up shot here. This is a sample of their typical home. It was a dome-shaped home made out of the grassy reeds that grew near the villages. Now, their main staple, the main thing that they ate, were the nuts inside of acorn shells. So acorns grow on oak trees, and as they would drop to the ground, they would crack them open and they would smash them. In fact, if you take a look here, this is an old Native American mortar and pestle, and they would use this pestle, put the seeds of the acorn inside, and they would smash them and mash them and make something that would be like a cornmeal, or maybe even cook them over a stove, and it would be something like a flatbread or a tortilla. That was their main food. But along with that, they ate berries, small animals, fish, and fowl. Now, these people were called the Tongva tribe. That's what they called themselves. Tongva means the people of the earth. Later on, when the Spaniards came, they named them a different name. They gave them the name of Gabrielino. And the reason they called them the Gabrielino is because they had built the San Gabriel mission there, named after Saint Gabriel. They also named the mountains of the area the San Gabriel Mountains. So the Tongva tribe became known as the Gabrielinos. Now, the Gabrielinos were the first ones that probably settled and visited this big hill that is still in Tustin today. This is called Red Hill. And today we know that there are many homes that are built in this area. But long ago, when the Gabrielinos lived here, they would run to this area. They called it Kataktu, and that means place of refuge or safety. And whenever there were great floods in the area of what is now Orange County, they would all run up to Red Hill for safety. And the reason we know that is because there have been Indian artifacts that they have dug up around the Red Hill area. Now the Spanish called Red Hill Cerrito de las Ranas, or even Las Ranas, which means the little hill of the frogs. And that's because many frogs lived on the swampy side of Red Hill. Now, Spanish also called Red Hill Cerro Colorado, which means Red Hill. And we have a sample of what was found there in Red Hill. Now these two rocks are cinnabar that would be dug up around Red Hill. In fact, that's why it was called the Red Hill, because of these red stones. And cinnabar has inside of it a mineral called mercury. And many times, or many years later, the settlers would be mining for cinnabar because they wanted to mine for mercury. Unfortunately, after many, many years of trying to mine, they just found out it wasn't very profitable. And so they stopped mining our Red Hill.
All right, now we're going to move from the time of prehistory, before people lived here in Orange County, to when we started to write history down. So we know a little bit more about this time period. Did you know that the land that we live on right now used to belong to Spain, and then it belonged to Mexico before it was California that we know? Well, 500 years ago, when only the Native Americans, the Gabrielino Indians, lived here, there were some explorers that visited, and they explored the whole coast of what is California now. And they claimed it for Spain, so that Spain claimed that they owned it. But the first settlers that came from Europe didn't even arrive for another 200 years. So in 1769, an Spanish explorer named Portola was appointed governor of Baja, or Lower California, and he decided that he wanted to explore this area. Portola and his men camped briefly as they passed through this area, and the route they took became known as El Camino Real, or the King's Highway. Then Spain decided that they better have people live here to keep their claim. So they decided to build 21 missions all the way up the coast of what is now California. Here is a map of the missions, and it went from what is today San Diego all the way up to San Francisco. And along that road, they called it the El Camino Real again, or the King's Highway, because they claimed it for the King of Spain. Most of the building of these missions was done by the local Native American Indians, of course. And Mission San Juan Capistrano, which many of you may have been to down not far off the 5 freeway, was built in 1776. That was the same year that the American Revolutionary War was raging on the east coast of our continent. The Spanish soldiers who were protecting the mission built their homes throughout the land around each mission. Many years later, the King of Spain gave the land to the soldiers as sort of a thank you for doing their job. This was the beginning of what we call the Rancho period. As years passed, many of the original Rancho owners died, and their sons inherited their land, so it was divided into smaller sections. And then around 1868, there was a widespread drought, which meant there was a lack of water. This made it very difficult for the Rancho owners to raise their cattle, to give enough food and water for their cattle. So they began to sell off their land to men who wanted it. These men then established small farms, orchards, and even small communities like the city of Tustin. And that takes us to how the town of Tustin began. Have you ever driven downtown Tustin? And on the corner of Main Street, you see a little statue. Well, that's a statue of the man that began our city of Tustin. His name was Columbus Tustin. Columbus Tustin, the founder of Tustin, was born actually in Pennsylvania. And he came west with his parents when he was 21 years old in a covered wagon. He lived in Northern California for quite a few years, where he was a very successful farmer and also a carriage maker. This is a photo, and it's the only known photo we have of Columbus Tustin. And up above it is a portrait that was painted using that photo many years later. In 1868, Columbus Tustin and his business partner, Nelson Stafford, heard that Rancho land in Southern California was being sold. Here is a map of the Rancho Santiago de Santa Ana Rancho. You can see how, as I said before, it was divided in half by his sons. This is the Yorba Rancho and the Peralta Rancho. And this little tiny rectangle in the middle shows the amount of land that Columbus Tustin and Nelson Stafford bought. They purchased 1,359 acres, all part of the original Rancho Santiago de Santa Ana. Columbus Tustin and Nelson Stafford were really attracted to this land. It had lots of fresh water, it had wildlife like squirrels and dove and deer. Large sycamore trees were throughout the area. Elderberry trees, wild mustard, a bright yellow plant grew wild. Wildflowers, and of course lots of prickly pear cactus. We are in a desert area. Along with the clean air and the nice weather, it was also a perfect place to invest their money. So Tustin and Stafford eventually split their land. Stafford's land became part of what became Santa Ana, and Tustin ended up with about 840 acres, which would eventually become the city of Tustin. In 1870, Columbus Tustin decided to move his wife and his children to his new land. His dream was to create a community where other people could move. He planned his town around 100 acres of his land, and he kept it very simple. He named his streets. The streets going north and south are named A Street, B Street, C Street, and D Street. And the streets going east and west were first, second, third, fourth, and so on. So if you come down Tustin, see if you can find those streets. They're easy to remember. Did you know that when we celebrated the 100th year of Tustin's founding in 1968, they renamed D Street to El Camino Real in honor of the original road between all of the Spanish missions. Tustin had difficulty getting people to move to his land, so he finally decided to promise people a lot of land, or a plot of land, to build their house for free if they would come to his town. He also knew that when people moved to Tustin, they needed different kinds of services. So he opened a one-room schoolhouse and hired one single teacher to teach the children in Tustin. He opened a post office and he became the postmaster. Slowly, as people came moving into the area, they opened stores, blacksmiths, grist mills, saloons, and even a church was built so the people had services in this town. More people began moving to Tustin, buying land from Columbus Tustin and building their homes. In the 1880s, the railroad came west. And of course, Tustin wanted the railroad to build a train station in his little town. Unfortunately, the railroad decided to build the station in Santa Ana. Therefore, Tustin stayed a really small little town, while Santa Ana grew to be a large metropolis. Sadly, when Tustin died in 1883, his little town was still very, very small. And although he died not knowing that his town was going to be a success, we know that he left a rich legacy for all of us to enjoy a wonderful city of Tustin today.